Wilkinson, thank you so much for making time for our show.
I'm glad to be here, David. Thank you for having me, man.
Yeah, we saw each other, ran into you in person. I think is that maybe the first time. I think it was last year at the Listen First Bridging Summit. That was nice to see you in person.
Yeah, it was really good to run into each other. I think that was probably the first time we've seen each other in person. I know we've had a handful of conversations over the years, but that was the one time we've met in person. So yeah, it was great.
Yeah, and I'm glad we finally got together for the show. So I'm looking forward to it. So one thing I wanted to talk about is I attend a lot of these bridging meetings with participants from the various bridge building practitioner organizations and so on. And all the times I'm witnessing these things, and I'm sort of hearing the way people are talking and stuff. And there's a lot of kind of left coded language, often, and I could imagine that. I mean, I'm kind of in a blue circle here, but also it's very purple where I am, and I have a pretty purple kind of personal network. So I
Hmm.
interact and have a lot of friends that are across the political spectrum, and I speak to them a lot. And I would imagine a lot of that language could be a little off-putting to some folks on the right. So, I think as a Christian conservative and I think self-described unicorn in the space, what are your thoughts on some of that and how can it sort of live up to its stated goal of sort of true cross-partisan health?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question, and it's a question that people in the bridging space need to probably ask more often and ask it of the right people. So I'm really glad you asked. Um, Yeah, I do describe myself as kind of a unicorn in this space, David, because back when I started my podcast in 2020, I didn't even know the bridging space existed.
Yeah,
I
same.
didn't know there was a thing called depolarization. I'd been on this personal journey of my own to kind of detoxify my mindset. But one of the last things that I really did was kind of work through that political polarization part. And until 2021, I didn't even know there was a depolarization space. But as a conservative, once people started to reach out to me about the bridge building space and the depolarization space, I quickly found out that yeah, there's not a lot of conservatives working in this space, and I was asked to do all of these different things because there were all of these people that really wanted to know, like dive deep into what I thought about things and really wanted to listen to what I was saying and find out how things were landing with me. So when you talk about like the blue coded language and things like that, it it resonates because again, I've done so many of these things where they're like, well, what if we said it like this? And I'll be like, well, I mean, you can say it like that. I think it's going to be quite off-putting to some people, and my worry there is not that it offends people, David, but what happens when it's said and then people's ears slam shut and the conversation ends? And that's what I don't want to see. I mean, now me personally, I hear all kinds of things that I that aren't going to resonate with me, that I'm not going to particularly like, but my ears aren't going to slam shut because I've been doing this for a while. But the question is how is it going to land for people outside of the bridging space, right? And then you've got to ask yourself, what is my desired outcome? What is my goal here in having this conversation? Am I going to say something just so I can say it, or am I going to say something in hopes that it lands with somebody and we can have a conversation about it? So I think it's hugely important that people think about those things, and when they're saying something, if you don't know how it's going to land with somebody that's not in the bridging space, you better be talking to somebody like me in the bridging space that you know it's going to at least be heard.
Yeah, and I think it's even true for folks that consider themselves sort of just centrist, right leaning, or even just centrist. I see some of this same kind of thing where I've seen people kind of have these back channel conversations with me about, wow, I really felt uncomfortable about that sort of approach and how they, sort of walked into that one. So yeah, I think it even goes beyond, even conservatives. So yeah, and it's challenging because sometimes you don't know we don't know you're doing. I've done lots of interviews with, I call sort of these man on the street interviews, and the biggest thing is we just don't see it because we have our sort of normal baseline and we consider that normal, but other people
Hmm.
outside our space may not consider that normal. So it's not like somebody has bad intent. I don't think.
Well, I don't think the vast majority of people, when they're saying things, David, I just don't think that the majority of people do have bad intent. It's
Right.
just we have, as a society, we've reached this ugly point of us versus them, where we're evaluating everything through the lens of almost enemies. This, I call it the us versus them tribalistic paradigm, or having these us versus them glasses on, that when you hear something, you instantly have to evaluate it through that particular lens. And if it doesn't resonate in terms of, is this safe because it's coming from us, or is this unsafe because it's coming from them? It changes the way that the conversation is had,
Yeah, and we're
or
constant.
where the way it's received anyway.
Yeah, and we're constantly we're really good as human species to like look for those signals and see them, even if they're not there.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly right. I think that's a hugely important point, even if it's not there. Back to the idea of most people don't have poor intent when they're saying it, but if that's the way that it's received, it changes the dynamic of the conversation, and and it's a paradigm. If I could snap my fingers and change any one thing, it would be to kind of remove that us versus them tribalistic paradigm from the way that we communicate.
Yeah, for sure. That'd be a nice magic pill to have for sure. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but if I could figure out a way to make it happen, David, I'm going to make it happen.
Yeah, well, so I wanted to ask a little bit too on this. That does this even go the other way a bit? That as a Christian conservative and Braver Angels director of media, I mean, do you feel pressure to sort of represent the conservative perspective, and kind of how do you reconcile that role on the other side of it? Being trying to be nonpartisan.
Yeah, well, I think there's a kind of a misconception there that I do want to clear up is, Braver Angels as an individual that works for Braver Angels, or even, a lot of our volunteer members and all the years that I was a volunteer, Braver Angels doesn't ask its members or even its staff to be nonpartisan, right? I mean, we speak our views freely, fully, and without fear, and we're not expected to surrender our own political opinions, at the door, so to speak, right? The thing about that, and I think here's the important distinction that I want all of your listeners to kind of take away from this is Braver Angels as an organization is not going to take a political stance on a particular thing, right? They are not going to take a position on a policy. They are not going to endorse a particular candidate or a particular candidate's party. But that does not mean that we, as members of that organization, whether it be a volunteer member, just a regular member that's part of the kind of the outer workings of this thing, or as a member of staff, we're not asked to surrender our strongly held beliefs and convictions. So to answer your question, me as a conservative, me as somebody who I've long considered myself a a Christian conservative. I don't try to allow, or I try to consciously not allow my conservatism to be part of my core identity, which I think helps a lot in having conversations with people across the aisle. But but in the work that I do and in the messaging that we're putting out at Braver Angels and stuff like that, we want more than anything, and I specifically, I'm not trying to change anybody's mind on a particular thing, but I'm trying to open up their mind to the idea that there's a lot of different perspectives out there, and we should kind of look at all those different perspectives for what they are. But that does not mean to surrender your personal convictions or your personal values or even your personal policy issues to some kind of uh, squishy middle or some surrender to some middle ground thing that's there. And I think it's important to remember that common ground and middle ground are two entirely different things, right? And people often confuse the two. They say, "Oh, well, you guys are just looking for this middle ground, this squishy middle." Well, no, we're not. What we would like people to see is, I want you to hold your strongly held convictions over here. I want you to hold your strongly held convictions over here, and that's completely all right. But instead of kind of surrendering to some compromise, middle ground, squishy, moderate area, how about we look for common ground, not necessarily in the positions, but who we are as human beings, so that when we're having these conversations, we don't lose sight of the humanity of the other person that does have an opposite position. I hope that answers your question, but and I probably went a long way to say it, but I think it's important to make those distinctions.
Yeah, and it's an important distinction to make, and we repeat it a lot on the show because yeah, that does it sort of seems to be a sticky thing that people have a hard time letting go of. And that said, so given that much of this work is kind of there is trying to foster that kind of humility and curiosity kind of thing. One thing I've seen happen is, and I think it can be an unintended consequence of some of these dialogue um, projects, is that people sometimes do kind of the one and done thing, right? Where they go to one event and they sort of get this sense of moral or intellectual superiority, like they're now the self-appointed depolarization police, and they're going to sort of go around and tell everybody else the right way to have conversation now, even though they only went to one meeting. I mean, I don't know. A, do you see that? And B, what do you think, we can do with some of the structure of these things, or are there some systemic things guardrails or something we can do to kind of avoid this kind of creation of these overconfident bridge builders?
Yeah, another fantastic question, David, and yeah, I would say that I've probably seen that before. It's not one of those things that I look for in a lot of those interactions, but I definitely have seen it. And I think you bring up an important point. There's a concept called I think it's called intergroup contact theory or intergroup dialogue. Um, and and it basically says that, if we have a conversation with an individual that disagrees with us, or or we have a conversation with somebody from a group that we think is a threat to civilization or whatever, or these different things, right? If somebody thinks, let's just use an example that seems to be timely, and that if somebody sees a particular group like Somalis in the United States as a very big threat, right? And then they say, okay, well, I'm going to have a conversation with somebody from the Somali community to really see how they are, right? I went to a bridge building event, and I'm kind of getting this thing. I know we've got to listen and whatever. So they have a conversation with somebody from the Somali community, and they find out, wow, this person is really pretty great. They're not nearly as bad as I expected them to be. And so it really changes their mindset on who that person is, and not like all of those people in terms of like the Somali community. you know so it changes their mind. But if they do it just once, they quickly fall back into kind of generalizing again about that particular community. It didn't really change that person's mind about the whole community anyway. It maybe changed their mind about that one particular person, but it didn't change their mind more broadly about the community. I think the same thing happens, David, with like, if we're going straight red blue divide, Republicans and Democrats. It's like, oh yeah, I've got that one liberal friend over there, and I have conversations, and I really like him, or I really like her, But you know what? They're kind of an outlier. I don't think that they're really, representative of all the people in that group. So my mind probably doesn't change about that group as a whole. It changes about them. And if I don't have constant conversations with that person, it's probably not going to last. It's not going to be an evergreen thing where I see that person as a decent person because, as our friend Monica Guzman says, those who are underrepresented in our lives will be overrepresented in our minds and our imaginations, and we're really not thinking the best of them. So if I'm not having a constant conversation with that person from the left, I might start to succumb to all the ugly things that are being said about people on the left, or if I'm on the left, vice versa. It works both ways. This is not exclusive to one side or the other. So if I am not having constant conversations with probably not just that one person, but multiple people within that group, I will succumb to all the ugly and hostile things that are being said by the respective other group online, and I think that's hugely unfortunate. That if we don't really make this a full concerted effort, because one interaction isn't going to do it, David. You and I both know that one interaction isn't going to do it. One workshop, whether it be from Braver Angels or any other bridging organization, it's not going to do it. This is a more complex thing, and it's a habit. So, and this is one of those things, and people, on the right will say this might be blue coded language, but flexing that civic muscle, like working that civic muscle, like building that muscle memory for civil discourse, it takes more than one time. You're not going to become a expert bridge builder by doing this one time. You're not gonna have it all figured out by having one conversation with one person from the other side.
Yeah, it's a good point because it's really important to note that it is a muscle type of it's a set of skills that aren't really natural, and they do require you to sort of learn them and engage with it actively because otherwise you're sort of that us and them brain sort of takes over, right? So yeah, it's something to keep in mind there that it's not a natural thing. We're kind of forcing ourselves to learn these skills because we don't have a lot of exposure to them or experience with them.
No, that's absolutely right.
So
That's
so you
absolutely right.
you mentioned that Monica Guzman quote, and I wanted to. That's a good lead into something I was going to talk about sort of this idea of how we often talk about in this space. A lot of us talk about this idea that you know we start seeing everybody as a caricature of something, right? And we don't even really realize that many times we don't really even have the fundamental disagreements we think we have. And you've been in media for a long time. You're now the director of media for Braver Angels, I believe, right? And
Yes.
and so I wanted to pick your brain on that. Like, you know, you're keeping sort of a nose to the ground. Is that the right metaphor? I don't know. You're trying to pay attention to what's happening in this space. You've been doing it for a while. Like, are you seeing anything that's like really promising? Like maybe there's some new, way to break in and maybe make a change in this media landscape around that?
Well, we we at Braver Angels have not or well, we don't currently have this big media air game. But that's something that we're working on in our next chapter is is finding a better of an understanding on how to connect with certain demographics, how to direct our messaging at the people who need it most, how to direct our messaging not just at those who are currently in the bridging space, but to get that messaging outside of the bridging space. Um, one of the things, David, that you've seen it, probably as clearly as anybody else is that in the media landscape, especially social media, but in the media landscape, we have what I call the fog model, and that's people who use fear, outrage, and grievance. It's kind of the trifecta of ugliness in media to keep people engaged and to kind of modify their behavior and more importantly to keep people divided. And it's really ugly, but it's true. So it's a very hard thing to overcome when you're working in the bridge building space and the bringing together of people space, because fear, outrage, and grievance, if you keep people scared, if you keep people mad, if you keep people aggrieved, and some of those grievances, sure, some are real, some are perceived, but it's there, right? It's a feeling. It elicits this emotional response. That is a hard model to overcome with bridging messaging because people have such short attention spans. And if you do not activate that emotional response immediately, you know, one of the things with short form content is people are often upwards of 70 people are scrolling through their social media feeds with the sound off, right? So if there's not a visual hook and you have about 1.7 seconds, if even, to grab that person's attention. So if they're listening or if they're viewing this, they're doom scrolling with their sound off. How do you capture their attention quickly without eliciting that emotional response that the outrage entrepreneurs and the grievance grifters are using? It's a very tough thing to do, but it's something that we're working on and trying to find out ways of capturing people's attention because it's really hard to convey that message in a very short amount of time. I do believe that we have the stronger message. I know that we are on the right side of history in trying to bring people together, but the question remains is how do we make that happen? And yeah, we do have our, if you want to say nose to the ground or ears on the tracks, how do we know, what's coming and what to make happen? We're working with some just incredible people here, at Braver Angels to find that right messaging. And in our next chapter at Braver Angels, we're talking a lot about courageous citizenship and how do we reclaim our agency as individuals, and how do we then take that out into our community to to uh, to bring people together to do important and positive things, and then how do we translate that into something media wise that's going to land with people, but land with them in the scope of that short attention span. So
Right. I mean, a lot of us kind of in the news literacy space are like over here, we're so worried about like what the institutional news is doing. And it's like most people aren't even looking at that anymore or listening to it or anything. Right. So it's like it's a whole new world that people have to deal with. And we can edit this out if, and I don't know if you've seen this came out last September, I think, from Carnegie. It was like Renee DiRista and Rachel Kleinfeld on sort of how institutions can speak, in the sort of media landscape. And I don't know if you read that or saw it, but it's some of the same stuff you're talking about. And it's an uphill battle. How do you send a nuanced message in 1.7 seconds?
yeah, yeah. Well, it's very tough. It is a very tough thing, and um, I've seen bits and pieces of that. I'm not familiar with the complete context of it, so don't really want to speak to that more broadly. But I think the big thing for everybody to understand and to take away from that is we cannot pretend that every problem that we have as a society comes from one side or the other, and we want to make sure that uh, you know we're not alienating any one group or pretending like one group or the other is not um is not going to be part of the conversation and things like that. So I think the big thing is and again back to what we said earlier is I think most people have good intentions with their messaging, but how is it going to land across the spectrum? And we when certain groups, and I will just say, let's say conservatives, because the media landscape is primarily dominated by people on the left side of the political spectrum, and the bridge building space is very much dominated by people on the left side of the political spectrum. When we're crafting that messaging and doing those things and working to build these bridge building coalitions and things like that, we it can't even be um, we just can't even have the perception that it's one side is going to be right and the other is going to be wrong. So that's where it does get a bit difficult. It does get tricky. Um, but the important thing to say about um, the way that those messages land is they can't be messages that are saying that this side's right and that side's wrong, or this is what we're going to do in order to change the behavior of the other side or whatever. Because I think behavior change messaging is not particularly positive, or trying to move the needle, so to speak, is not particularly good messaging. The finding a deeper understanding of those with whom we disagree, that's the right kind of messaging, and I think that's what we're all trying to work towards.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. So, yeah, so you mentioned agency. So maybe I'll wrap up with with a conversation about that. So I hear from my listeners, and I've seen a shift. A lot of people are feeling kind of hopeless, and they do feel like they don't have much agency in this. I vote and it doesn't really matter, and these people go still do those things, and even if I go to a Braver Angels meeting, I come back and people are still doing the things I don't want them to do. So, um, what are this? Tell us a little bit about the things you can point to, to maybe offer some tangible agency and kind of more immediate too. Like sometimes we talk about civic renewal. That sounds like a really long term big thing. Maybe there's something we can do more in the more immediate time frame.
Yeah, so I will tell you, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, right at the beginning of our conversation, David, is for me, my journey to this thing started with like my own personal journey of how I was reacting to things that were outside of my control. I had a lot of anger and animus from throughout my early adult years because of a lot of things that happened throughout my childhood and then my younger adult years, and so I'd been on this personal journey because I was just tired, and I was just tired of being mad all the time. I was tired of just being pissed and angry and just all of the problems that I had in my life.
It
Finally, I went,
sounds like outrage overload. It sounds like
that
you hit
sounds like
outrage
outrage
overload.
overload, right? It was outrage overload. That's absolutely right. And that outrage overload for me manifested itself into a lot of broken bones, mine, other people's, breaking walls, breaking stuff that I ended up having to pay for again and again, and hospital bills and just an extraordinary amount of pain all the time. And one of the things that comes along with that, or should, and I hope it does for most people because it was really a saving grace for me, was to kind of reach that point where I said, you know what, the common denominator in all those problems, all those things, the one common denominator is me, you know. So maybe I need to fix me and see what happens, right? And so I started reading a lot of books, and one of my favorite books of all time is A Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl talks about how the one thing that his captors, they could do anything to his body, but they'd never get his mind, and how he responded to what was happening. And so I go back to this phrase of, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And it's in that space we get to choose our response. And I think it very much applies when we think about agency and how we are going to react to all of those things outside of our control. But for the purposes of kind of bridge building and rebuilding, this civic renewal thing, right? How are we going to react to all of those people that are saying things that we don't like? You know, how are we going to react to all the things that are done in Washington, D.C., over which we have very, very little control? You know, how are we going to react um, when our city council does something that we don't like, or somebody within our neighborhood, our cul-de-sac, does, we do not like? We have to start compartmentalizing all of those different things and say, what do I have control over and what don't I have control over? How can I affect change in a positive way on these different things? Some of them I can, some of them I can't. But the thing is, if we focus on all of those things that we cannot control, we easily fall into that mindset you're talking about, right? Overwhelmed and I just can't do anything, and the system is rigged, and we call it blackpilling. Why do I even try? Why do I even try? The whole thing's messed up. It's a rigged system. I can't do anything about it. Well, that may be the case if you're thinking about and constantly thinking about all those things outside of your control. But if you start to focus on those things that are in your control, those things over which you can affect positive change, you change the dynamic of your life. There's a weight that's lifted off of you. Um, we have this little thing in the back of our brainstem called the reticular activating system, and it says we can only focus on so many things at one time. You know, and if and it's going to point out the similarities, and it's going to affect our confirmation bias, and it affects all of these different things. But if we're focused on things that are outside of our control all the time, that's all we will see. That's all we will think about is all of the things outside of our control. But if we start to work on those things, David, that are close to us, those things that we do have agency over, we will start to see more of those things, and we will start to act positively in those different things. And we start to work through the things that we do have agency over, and we build that muscle. We start to see ways to positively move forward in our actions. And then we bring that out into our community, and then we can see things in a different light, and come up with solutions to common cause problems that me and my neighbors have, and then we can get things done in a positive way. And I can't express to people enough, start where you are, start with who you are, and start to look at what you have control over, and in that space between stimulants, or in that space between stimulus and response, that space, that's your space. Use it wisely, and see how much your life changes. That's what agency is.
Yeah, that's great. And I think another big point there that is often kind of lost in this. Sometimes when people think about, we talk about, build bridges or whatever we're calling it, other people might know it by in their common language, depolarization, or just something else. Like you say, I didn't know what depolarization was. I didn't know what bridge building was when I started this journey. But I still had this idea that what can we do about the division and things like that, right? And often we think about this, that if we're going to sort of go work in this, we think we're doing it for sort of, some people out there. Like we're going to go do this and either going to fix somebody else, or we're just going to, we're going to help other people. It's like, no, a huge piece of this is helping yourself, right? Like you can
Yeah.
do this for sort of selfish reasons, sort of.
Well, I think it's very. I don't have any problem with the idea of doing it for selfish reasons. Gandhi said, "Be the change that you want to see in the world." You know what? If I want to see a better world around me, I got to be a better person, because it's me that's going to be the change that I want to see. And some people might call it selfish. I call it pretty darn smart.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's self care is what it is, really, right?
It
I mean,
is.
yeah. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it's yeah, exactly. So I think that's a piece sometimes people miss. Like they see it as they're being sort of altruistic, and I'm going to go do this for the benefit of other people. When in reality, it's a huge benefit to ourselves.
Well, it's a huge benefit to ourselves, and I think the byproduct is it's better for everybody else too.
Right.
You know, I keep on going back to the idea of, they're one of the things that we're seeing in the world today, specifically in social media, is all the ugliness, and people who have allowed their emotions to take over a lot of their logic, and they say and do things that are guided by the ugliest part of them, their emotions, based on something that's outside of their control. But how different would the world be, David, if people would step back for a second and say, you know what? I could react poorly to this, but I can also choose to act in a better way and not say this thing, or not do this particular thing. And how much different would the world be if people just took that second to say, and sometimes it's just a microsecond, right? But take that little bit of time and say, I'm going to choose my response, and I'm going to choose the better way to do this, and not be part of the problem. I want to be part of the solution, and it changes the dynamic of everything.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Wilkinson, thank you so much for making time for our program.
It's been a great pleasure, David. I've very much enjoyed it, and keep up the great work.
Yeah, I really enjoyed speaking with you, and people can find you at D-Rate the Hate podcast and also over at Braver Angels as well, right?
Absolutely. DRateTheHate.com and braverangels.org.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you.